The Hive Protocol. Episode 1, Cold Contact. The lab's hum was a death rattle. Vexx's fingers curled around the vial, veins pulsing with something that shouldn't have been there. Something cold, foreign, alive. The neurospice inside glowed pale blue, innocent as morning light, lethal as vacuum. His breath came shallow. The air around his hands shimmered, not with heat but with absence, with the kind of cold that doesn't creep but strikes. The Hive had warned him. Their voices echoed in his memory, layered and insectoid, speaking as one organism. Neurospice purifies the mind, but the body remembers. He dismissed their fear, called it superstition, called it control. Now, as frost crystallized on the metal workbench, spreading in delicate fractals from his fingertips, he understood their terror was knowledge. The door behind him exploded inward, not blown, kicked. The guard moved with military precision, armor clanking, blade already drawn. The weapon caught the fluorescent light, a curved thing designed to open arteries efficiently. Vexx turned, slow, deliberate, the vial still in his hand. The guard's blade swept toward his throat. Mid-swing, the air itself seemed to flinch. The metal went from singing steel to brittle glass in the space between heartbeats. When it connected with the workbench's edge instead of flesh, it shattered. Fragments scattered across the floor, tinkling like wind chimes made of winter. The guard stared at the hilt in his hand, confusion breaking through trained stoicism. Vexx's breath fogged the observation glass across the room, but the cold wasn't his, it was inside, spreading through his bloodstream like ink through water, and it was winning. He ran. 72 hours earlier. Pharmagrow Synthesis Lab, Subsector 12. Third compliance audit this month. Vexx moved through the facility the way he moved through all of them. Efficiently, invisibly, taking up exactly as much space as his credentials required, and no more. The lead technician was reciting batch numbers from memory, the particular flatness of someone who had given this presentation 40 times and expected it to end the same way it always ended. Approved. Next inspection in 40 days. Have a good morning. Vexx watched the synthesis array and said nothing. They were running the catalytic process at 310 Kelvin. He knew without calculating, without checking, that 340 would triple their yield efficiency. Their precursor ratios were wasting 30% of the reagent mass through incomplete bonding. A first-year error, the kind that happened when you hired for speed and certified for compliance rather than understanding. The separation column was misaligned by 4 degrees, not enough to trigger a violation, enough to cost them 11% of their output every single run. He could fix all of it in 40 minutes. He had fixed problems like this in his sleep, in his actual sleep, waking with solutions fully formed that he wrote down and filed away and never showed anyone because that was not his job. His job was to check the boxes. His job was to determine whether the numbers fell within acceptable parameters, stamp the form, and leave. His upper left hand was pressing the stylus to the tablet. His lower hands were still. That stillness was the only tell, the Quarathi equivalent of clenched teeth. Batch 447G, the technician said. Temperature maintained at 310 Kelvin. Pressure at 1.4 atmospheres. Yield rate 82% of theoretical maximum. 82%. That was what their incompetence cost them. 18% of every batch, every day, every year. Vexx had been running these numbers in his head for 6 months. Across all 11 licensed synthesis operations in Subsector 12, the aggregate waste was staggering. Resources, time, potential, all of it draining away because the people with the equipment didn't have the knowledge, and the person with the knowledge stamped forms and went home. He pressed the stylus down, approved. The technician visibly relaxed. Vexx walked to his transit pod and sat. The pod hummed to life, pulling away from the docking ring, carrying him back toward the research quarter. Outside the viewport, Orbital Station 7 curved away in both directions, a massive ring spinning slowly against the gas giant's amber clouds, indifferent and enormous. He looked at his 4 hands. His lower left was trembling. It had started 3 weeks ago. Just that hand, just a slight tremor when he was tired. Now it was spreading. Now it was something he had to think about, had to compensate for, had to hide from anyone who might notice and ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. He turned his hands over, studying them. 4 hands that had spent 20 years filing reports about other people's chemistry. 4 hands that could solve in an afternoon what those technicians couldn't solve in a decade. 4 hands, trembling slightly on the left side, and somewhere behind his sternum, a cold that had no business being there. Trace amounts, the medical report had said. Absorption through skin, statistically improbable at the exposure level. Resolution expected within 72 hours. That had been 68 hours ago. Dr. Chelm's office smelled of recycled air and careful neutrality. The particular scent of a space designed to deliver bad news without adding to the ambient misery. The cellular analysis came back this morning, she said. I wanted to deliver the results personally. Vexx nodded. He had already run the numbers himself, extrapolating from the tremor progression rate and the cold spreading through his chest. He knew what she was going to say. He had been sitting with it for 4 days, turning it over, looking for the error in his own calculations, hoping he had made one. He hadn't. Cascade lung rot, she said. Degenerative. Untreated, you have 8 cycles. 8 cycles. He had worked it out at 2.3 million hours, give or take. He had also worked out the treatment cost, the insurance coverage, the gap between them, and the number of cycles it would take at his current salary to close that gap. The answer was 11. He had 8. 400,000 credits, he said, not a question. Station basic coverage provides 12,000. I've filed the appeals. It will take 11 cycles to accumulate sufficient funds through standard channels. You just told me I have 8. Dr. Chelm looked at him with the specific expression of someone who had prepared a response for this moment and found, in the moment itself, that it was inadequate. I'm sorry, Vexx. He thanked her. He walked to his transit pod. He sat. He looked at his 4 hands. His comm unit chimed. A reminder. Mira's school performance review, 3rd cycle of the year. He had promised to attend. He had promised because Mira had asked him to, specifically by name, because at 7 years old, she still believed his presence in a room changed the quality of the air. He would be there. He would sit in a small chair designed for smaller beings and listen to her teacher describe her extraordinary aptitude for molecular biology. She had inherited that, unmistakably. And he would smile and ask the right questions. And afterward she would hold his lower left hand all the way to the transit pod, and he would not let her feel it trembling. He had 8 cycles. He needed 400,000 credits. His mind, entirely against his will, began to calculate. The message arrived at 0200 hours, encrypted, routing through 3 dead relays before it reached his personal terminal. Vexx had been awake. He had been awake most nights for the past week, sitting in the dark with his calculations, looking for an error that wasn't there. The message was brief, a name he recognized, a location, a time. KRYO. He had worked with her for 2 years in the Hive's research division before she disappeared. Officially reassigned, the record said, though no one he asked could say where. He had not thought about her in months. Now her name on his terminal at 0200 felt less like coincidence, and more like something he didn't have a word for yet. He went. The location was a maintenance corridor in Subsector 4, the kind of space that existed between the official maps, service access tunnels, recycler shafts, the infrastructure skeleton that kept the station alive and remained invisible to everyone who didn't maintain it. KRYO was waiting in an alcove between 2 recycler housings, her frame angular and tense, the chemical burns on her left cheek catching the maintenance lighting in patterns that looked almost deliberate. You look terrible, she said. You look like someone who's been hiding, he said. She handed him a data chip without preamble. He turned it over in his upper right hand, the steadiest one now, the last to show the tremor. Neurospice synthesis files, she said. Pre-Hive, the original research, not what they put on the public record, the actual molecular architecture, The full pathway. She paused. You know what street neurospice sells for at 40% purity? 60,000 credits per kilo. You could hit 98%. It was not a question. She had worked with him for 2 years. She knew what he could do. 3 kilos, he said. His mind had already done the arithmetic before she finished her sentence. 180,000 credits. Not enough for full treatment. Enough to extend, to buy time, to find another solution. I need 108,000 credits immediately. I can discuss the rest afterward. What happened to you? She asked. She was looking at his lower left hand. He put it in his pocket. Show me your lab. The mobile lab was cramped and smelled of inadequate ventilation, but it had what it needed. A catalytic chamber, a pressure vessel, a centrifuge, pH sensors, temperature control equipment that was old, but calibrated. KRYO had been careful about the calibration. He noticed that immediately. She left him alone with it. That was the right decision. He stood in the center of the lab for a long moment, not touching anything, just looking, taking inventory, running the synthesis in his mind from beginning to end, noting where the standard approach failed and where his approach diverged. The Hive's neurospice was impure because they prioritized volume. Street product was impure because the independent operators didn't understand the third stage, the crystallization phase, where temperature had to drop in precise increments and pH had to be held at 3 decimal places, 1 degree off, 1/100th of a pH unit. That was the difference between 40% purity and something else entirely. He began. His lower left hand was trembling. He used his upper left for the precision work. Stage 1. Precursor combination. The reagents went in at exactly 340 Kelvin, not 310, the way every licensed facility ran it, not 350, the way the Hive's bulk operations ran it when they were behind schedule. Exactly 340. The temperature where the molecular bonds formed with the geometry they needed, the specific spatial arrangement that made the difference between a substance that produced mild perceptual enhancement and one that restructured neural architecture at the synaptic level. His forearms moved in their natural rhythm, the rhythm he'd had since childhood, the one that had made his mother say he was born for laboratory work, the one he had spent 20 years hiding behind compliance forms and approval stamps. Lower left monitoring the temperature gradient, lower right measuring and introducing the secondary reagents in precise sequence, upper left preparing the catalytic bed with the modifications the standard protocol didn't include, upper right watching pressure and flow, making micro adjustments every 40 seconds. He had not felt like this in years. He had not felt like this, he realized, since he was 17 years old and running synthesis experiments in his secondary school's inadequate lab, producing results that made his instructor go very quiet and then very careful about who saw them. That feeling, of his mind and his hands working together at full capacity, of a problem yielding to him precisely because he understood it better than anyone else in the room, had been the best thing he had ever felt. And he had spent 20 years learning to feel it less, to make himself smaller, to ensure that the gap between what he could do and what he was observed doing never became visible enough to be threatening. The centrifuge spun up, smooth and even. He listened to the pitch change as the separation progressed, and knew from the sound alone that the ratios were correct. Stage 2 complete, Stage 3 beginning. Crystallization. This was where it happened or it didn't. Temperature dropping in increments of 0.3 degrees every 90 seconds. pH held at 7.441. The crystals forming in the solution, each one a precise molecular lattice, each one either right or slightly wrong, and slightly wrong was the same as entirely wrong. He watched the crystals form. They were right. He knew they were right before the analyzer confirmed it. He knew by the color, the pale blue deepening to something closer to violet at the edges, the specific optical property of a pure crystalline structure, and by the way the solution clarified as the crystals grew, the impurities falling away because there was simply no room for them in a lattice this precise. The analyzer chimed. 98.3%. He looked at the reading for a long moment. The number sat in the air between him and the equipment, patient and exact. "There you are," he said quietly, not to KRYO, who was not in the room, not to himself exactly, to the chemistry, to the thing he had spent 20 years pretending he was less than. "There you are." The pounding started 40 seconds later. Not security. The rhythm was wrong for station security. Too aggressive. Too certain. KRYO appeared in the inner doorway, her face doing the specific calculation of someone tallying bad options. "Hive Collective," she said. "They monitor synthesis radiation signatures in this sector. 2, maybe 3. Tactical armor." Vexx looked at the crystallized product on the lab bench. Then he looked at the synthesis byproducts in the containment canisters on the lower shelf. His mind moved the way it always moved, not toward panic but toward the next calculation, the next variable, the next solution. "Canister 3, he said. "Bring it here." The door came in on the second impact. 2 of them. Insectoid exoskeletons under tactical plating. The particular body language of people who expected this to take 30 seconds and were already thinking about the report they'd file afterward. "Unlicensed synthesis," the first one said. "You're operating in Hive territory. Tribute of..." Vexx released canister 3. The synthesis byproduct was a concentrated acid-base compound, pressurized, designed for neutralizing chemical waste. It was not designed as a weapon, but it reacted with chitin-based exoskeleton material in a way that was not difficult to calculate if you understood the molecular composition of both substances, which Vexx did, which the Hive's enforcers presumably did not. 90 seconds. That was how long it took. He did not watch. He was already securing the product, calculating how much they could carry, what they had to leave behind. KRYO was pressed against the pressure shielding, not breathing. When the sound stopped, she looked at the 2 shapes on the floor, and then at Vexx, and her expression went through several stages in rapid succession before settling on something that was not quite fear and not quite recognition. "You just..." "Removed the variable," Vexx said. He was sealing the transport container. His hands were steady. All 4 of them, including the left. "We have approximately 9 minutes before their biosignatures trigger an alert at Hive Command. Do you have industrial solvent?" She stared at him. "KRYO, the solvent." She moved. He returned to his quarters at 0340 hours. The station was in its night cycle. Reduced lighting, minimal transit traffic, the particular stillness of a place that never fully slept but came close. He stood in the hygiene chamber and looked at his reflection. Behind him, barely visible through the open doorway, were Mira's decorations for her upcoming ascension ceremony. She had made them herself, the traditional woven fiber patterns in Quarathi ceremonial colors, hung from the doorframe, referencing through their design the lineage they were celebrating. In 3 weeks, Vexx would stand before the community gathering, and his ridge spines would be blessed, and Mira would receive her own, as an adult member of the family line, connected by the physical fact of his spines to every generation before her. The ridge spines ran along his skull in 2 parallel rows, 12 total. Each one a calcified growth that had formed during his adolescent development, each one representing, in Quarathi cultural understanding, a link in the chain of accountability. His actions were not only his. They attached, through the spines, to everyone who shared his lineage. This was the point. This was the design. To remove the spines was to cut the chain. It was done, in Quarathi tradition, only in extremis, by those who were about to do something their family could not be held responsible for. It was a declaration. What follows is mine alone. My family bears no shame for it. Because I have severed the connection, they are protected. I am, in the relevant cultural sense, no longer part of them. It also meant Mira's ascension could not proceed as planned. No father's spines, no blessing. The ceremony would have to be restructured or postponed. She was 7. She would not understand for years. He thought about her holding his hand on the way to the transit pod, the specific weight of her smaller hand in his, trusting the steadiness of his grip without checking for it. He picked up the ceremonial tool. The first spine came free with a sound he had not expected. Not a crack, but something wetter, more organic, the protest of living tissue separating from itself. The pain was significant. He catalogued it and continued. Second. Third. Iridescent purple welling from each site, catching the hygiene chamber's light. He did not hurry. Hurrying would have made it easier. He wanted it to take exactly as long as it took. By the sixth spine, he was breathing through the pain in controlled intervals. By the ninth, his reflection had become someone he didn't entirely recognize. The familiar face with its compound eyes and mandibles and gray chitinous skin. But the skull altered, the social marker removed, the visible sign of his place in a chain of people who would wake tomorrow and go about their lives not knowing that the chain had been cut. 12. The 12th came free and he set the tool down and stood for a moment in the silence. Then he cleaned the sites with methodical care, applied the sealing compound, and went to bed. He did not sleep. She had been awake since 0200. Not because of the sounds. He had been quiet. He was always quiet. But because of the quality of his absence from the sleeping room, the specific texture of a space where someone is not present who should be. After 11 years, she knew the difference between his absence because he was working and his absence because something was wrong. She sat at the common area terminal with the family financial records open and worked through them the way she worked through everything, systematically, without assumptions, following the data where it led. The withdrawal 3 weeks ago she had noticed at the time and set aside. Emergency consultations, he'd said. Medical things. She had not pressed because he had the specific expression he got when something was not ready to be discussed yet, and she had learned over 11 years to wait. But there were other things now. Small things that did not add up. Transit records that didn't match the routes he described. Time logged at the compliance office during hours when the office was closed. A chemical supply requisition that had been filed under his credentials, and then the filing scrubbed. Badly scrubbed. The kind of deletion that left traces for anyone who knew where to look. And Skyza knew where to look. Her infrared middle eye was open. It was always open when she was working. She had learned young to process the thermal information as background data, letting it inform her understanding without consciously attending to it. Now it was showing her the heat residue of recent activity on the terminal Vexx used. The specific warmth of keys recently pressed, a search recently conducted, information recently found that had elevated the user's stress response to measurable levels. She had been a transaction specialist for 14 years. She knew what hidden numbers looked like. The news service was running on the secondary screen. Low volume, background habit. She had not been paying attention to it until a phrase cut through. 2 Hive collective personnel, unresponsive, equipment malfunction, investigation ongoing, subsector 4. Her middle eye focused on the screen. The thermal signature of the terminal keys was still warm. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. 4-armed Quarathi gait, slightly uneven, the particular heaviness of someone who had not slept. She closed the financial records. She composed her expression into something that was not the expression she was actually wearing. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her awake. She looked at his skull, at the sealed sites where his ridge spines had been, at the evidence of what he had done to himself, alone, in the hygiene chamber, while she was in the other room. She understood in that moment what kind of thing had already been decided. "You're home late," she said. "Equipment issue at the maintenance bay." He paused. "The recycler." The silence between them had a specific texture, the texture of 2 people who know the same thing and have agreed, without discussing it, not to say it yet. "I love you," he said, still not turning around. She looked at the space where his spines had been, at the sealed sites, at the evidence of the chain he had cut to protect her, to protect Mira, to ensure that what was coming could only reach him. "I know," she said. He went to bed. She stayed at the terminal, her middle eye open, the news service running, and she sat with what she knew for a long time before she finally turned it off. In the sleeping room, Vexx lay still in the dark and listened to his own breathing and felt the cold moving through him, steady and patient, claiming one more degree of warmth with every hour. In the darkness behind his eyes, something that was not quite his own mind began, very quietly, to whisper. End of episode 1.